So this is unique. I mean, for example, if you were to go onto the BBC tonight, despite the fact that they spend 300 million pounds a year in Scotland, I mean, you scarcely know, you'll never see anyone like James, ever, ever, until he takes over the BBC after some sort of constitutional settlement. But until that happens, you'll never see anyone like James. You will rarely see anyone like yourself on the BBC. Why? Because it's run by a bunch of old guys. Yeah, I don't care too much. Yeah, they get paid. They get paid whether you like them or not. How does that happen? Would you like a job like that? Of course you would. I would love a job like that, where it doesn't matter how I treat the customers. It doesn't matter how abusive I am, how inaccurate I am as a journalist. These things don't matter. All I have to do is satisfy one guy in London, and I keep my job, and better still, I get promoted. Hey, what's not to like? Yeah? I told you that's the job I would like, and I'm sure it's the job that you would like. And I'm sure it's the job that James would love. Who's James?
100%.
Yeah, you see. James, it's great that you're on the show tonight.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey.
Well, I was too young in 2014 for the whole referendum. I was still too young for the campaign. I was only 12. I'm 21 now, not to make anyone feel old. But so I didn't care. It wasn't anything to me. But I remember I knew about it, and I asked my grandma and everything, what's Scottish independence? Don't remember what she said. It was so long ago. But after that, I knew that I wanted it, but obviously the campaign kind of died down until Brexit. And it wasn't really until 2021 that I really started getting into it. And then last year I moved to London, and that's when Nicola announced the referendum was going to happen. But I was hundreds of miles away, so I was like, oh, what can I do? So that's when I started posting, because obviously I wasn't here, I couldn't do anything in person. And ever since then, I've just got more passionate and more passionate. And like, obviously I didn't vote in 2014, but in 2021, obviously what was offered to us was a second vote. And obviously independence parties won, but that's been sort of denied. And what's really interesting is if, our Holyrood Parliament had a first past the post system, independence parties would have had 62 seats and unionist parties would have only had 11. Now, that should tell you all you need to know. We should have had a vote, blah, blah, blah. But I think I've just gotten more and more passionate as the times went on. And
why is that, James? Why have you become more passionate? Because you see, old people don't react that way. Old people, when somebody gets in their way, they say, "Oh, that's life. I can't go on. It's too difficult. Everyone's against me." You've reacted exactly the opposite. Why is that?
Well, people insinuate that Scotland's a region of the UK, and it's like, no, we're a nation, and we can't be, told what to do, sort of thing. And I've gotten more and more passionate as the political route is not going anywhere. And then, for example, I found Salvo that relighted hope. Obviously, politicians are still fighting for it, which is still hopeful, obviously. And I've looked a lot into the system we had before the union and the system that we have now. Before the union, we had a system, there was laws passed to protect the people from famine. The people were sovereign. It was high treason to claim sovereignty over the people. Whereas the system that we live in right now is that the Parliament in London is sovereign. And when I look at that, I definitely know which system I would rather have.
Oh, really? Well, that's interesting. I mean, that everything you've said is pretty much accurate, I would say, in historical terms. But wouldn't you agree, though? And I'm maybe a little bit devil's advocate here, but let's proceed with this.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that it's not just Scotland who's disadvantaged because Westminster is sovereign? People in England, in Wales, and dare I say it, in Northern Ireland, many of them, thousands of them, maybe millions of them, feel the same way. I mean, they're the people who are going to the supermarket in Swindon, in Hull, in Newcastle, and looking at the prices of fruit and vegetables and saying, I remember during the Brexit campaign, I was told if I voted for Brexit, everything would be cheaper. That's on record.
No.
I mean, so it's not just a Scottish thing, surely. Surely everyone across this island, increasingly must feel, God, I was cheated. They told me this and they gave me that.
Oh, 100%. And I think that's a part of the reason that I do support independence, because if Scotland can make change and show that it works, that will give the people of Wales, the people of England, and the people of Northern Ireland that they can also have change and not be subject to what politicians want in, obviously, Westminster, getting rich for themselves. Our energy bills are skyrocketing while we stay poor. And that's a big part of it. If we can prove that change is possible and positive change, it can light up hope in the other free nations of the UK as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of validity in what you just said, and I mean, I speak to lots of people on the TNT show who do not lots, but some people in the TNT show who don't believe at all independence. They just think it's absolutely nuts, and their conversations are peppered with, this is what I read in the Daily Mail, so it must be true. And they said this about Nicola Sturgeon, they said that about John Sway, they said this about Alex Abbott, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on. There's a great litany of things. If you watch any daytime television show, I don't have to rehearse it here tonight. But the reality is that at the end of the day, you've got a situation where there is a parliament in Westminster which is sovereign. It's certainly it feels it's sovereign. Right. It's not hugely fussed about what the people think, really. And you could argue, why should it? Because, if I'm sovereign, why should I care what you think? Right. Now, what you've just argued is that the people ought to be sovereign.
Aye.
And the Westminster or any parliament ought to be subservient to the people, not the other way around.
Oh, 100%. I believe that's the way it should be. That's a real democracy. And obviously, you get arguments that we can have change within the UK, but if you look at the powers that are reserved, the powers that are devolved, for example, taxes, Scotland only controls 36% of our tax raising powers. And then also things like foreign policy are reserved. And if we really want change, we need those powers either devolved or in full independence. For example, obviously, as we know, since 2000, we've been involved in a couple of wars. I truly don't believe that an independent Scotland would be involving itself in things like that. I believe that we would be a peaceful, progressive country that truly only cares about caring about our people.
Okay, let me put a point to you then. Craig Camp, I guess Craig, it's Craig Campbell perhaps. Apologies, Craig, if I've misconstrued your name. He said, look, people are getting rich for themselves. What about motorhomes?
See, and that's what people do. Independence isn't about any politician. It's not about any government. It's about the people, obviously, having the choice to chuck out those governments that are doing things like that. And right now, there's obviously this divide, independence people, unionists, and I think it's going to continue until it's changed. And obviously you do have all those things that are happening in the SNP right now, but personally, I'm not going to speak about the camper vans. There's an ongoing, police investigation. It would be wrong of us to speak about the things that are involved in that. And as we know, the camper van is one of them.
Well, I think I mean, let's deal with some of the broader aspects. Let's leave camper vans to themselves, because it could turn out to be a perfectly legitimate expense. Who knows? I don't know. I haven't seen the accounts, and I'm not in a position to talk about them. Unlike the BBC, which feels itself completely unconstrained by their coverage, but that's their lookout, and they'll have to defend themselves, possibly in court when the time comes. if there's any police action there. But the reality is that you've got a situation here where you've got a bunch of people in one part of the island who are saying, look, we would like to have a different constitutional settlement. At the same time, they're saying, because I watched the broadcast, so I have to believe this is true, that the First Minister was in London asking the head of the British Parliament for permission to carry out a referendum. Now, a lot of people are thinking to themselves, this is a contradiction. Either these people regard themselves as sovereign, in that case, they don't need permission from anyone, or they're not sovereign, in that case, they do need permission. Which is it?
I can see, so personally, I certainly wouldn't ask, can we have a referendum? Can we leave? The answer is always, they're always going to say no, like they've proved essentially. And I believe the people have shown their voice in 2021. Obviously, like we just said, if they had a first past the post system, independence parties would have had 62 seats, unionists would have had 11. I think that's, a pretty clear mandate and voice, but we're not going to get a vote. And that's the thing. So we need to look at alternative routes, obviously peaceful routes.
Okay, somebody has been in touch to say, look, you already had a referendum, you lost, and all you do is cry about it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I didn't lose any referendum. I didn't vote in 2014. I won my vote, and the only thing that I've voted in is 2021. Obviously, independence parties did offer a second chance. The constitutional circumstances are completely different now. In 2014, obviously, we were told if you leave the UK, you aren't having the EU. We were told if we stay in the UK, we could have the EU. It didn't happen. There's also other things. The Better Together campaign, we're saying it was all scare stories that Boris Johnson would become Prime Minister. It was scare stories, this and that. But obviously, we have the power of foresight now. None of them were scare stories. They all came true by us staying in the union. And obviously, we don't know if the scare stories from the Better Together campaign would have came true or not, because obviously that's not how things went.
Before I ask you the next question, let me add a quick technical point. Julianne, you're asking, is it possible for someone to record the show? All of these shows are available on YouTube afterwards. And we've done almost 150 over a couple of 3 years. So you can see not just this show, but you'll be able to see all of these other shows as well. And just as a little plug, we've interviewed scientists and politicians and actors. So if you, for example, if you liked Brian Cox in Succession and lots of other movies, he's doing a James Bond movie soon, that he's on the show, one of our earlier shows. So, if anybody wants to look at this show or any previous shows, go on YouTube, you'll find it all there. You don't have to reset your TikTok, you don't have to do any of these things. It's there, it's available, and feel free, because unlike the BBC, no license, no problem. You can watch this show anytime you like. There's no charge whatsoever. And you get people of the quality of James tonight. What's not to like? Come on.
Thank you.
So here we are. We've got this Parliament in Westminster that decides everything, pretty much. Because that's the way it's set up. If you've got a decent enough majority in the House of Commons, you don't have to care about what anyone says.
No.
Now, this is nothing new, by the way. This has always been the case. And there've been every attempt to change it, almost every attempt to change it has failed. For example, 100 years ago, the Labour Party, when it first emerged through its birth pangs in Scotland, by the way, when it first emerged, one of its primary objectives, and it's been repeated ad nauseum throughout all of that time between then and now, was they were planning to abolish the House of Lords. The reality is, they send people to the House of Lords.
They've never done it. I'm pretty sure they put that in their manifesto last time. I'm pretty sure Keir Starmer's backtracked on it now, though. I think the House of Lords is really undemocratic. None of them are elected. Obviously, the only power they really have now is, I'm pretty sure they can obviously veto a law, but then the House of Commons can, push it through anyway, sort of thing. But I would rather have everyone elected in a parliament.
Of course. I mean, let's put this. Let's put a little dose of reality into that. What you just said, because you, with respect, you slightly understated it. The reality is that, first of all, there are hundreds of them.
Aye.
There are over 800 people in the House of Lords. I think if they all turned up, they'd have to find another building. Aye. So you've got 800 people there, right? All of these people were appointed. Not one single person in the House of Lords was elected. No. Not one. And you made the point, and I think it's a great one, they make laws. They make laws, right? Now, if you look around the world, and let me tell you what's even worse than that. What's even worse than that is, I'm getting comfortable now because I feel it's an interesting point. What's worse than that is the fact that a bunch of them were there for religious reasons.
Yeah. Not
only were they appointed, right, not just from the hoi polloi, they were appointed because they are members of a particular religion, right? Now, there are only, I think, one other place in the world where a legislative body contains clerics who make laws. Do you know which country that is?
No.
Iran.
Oh.
We're keeping good company here. Aren't we keeping good company here? Only in Iran. And I think maybe, and I'm not sure about this, so it's worth checking, I think maybe in the Vatican. But apart from these two, right, the UK is the only country in the world where clerics make laws because they are clerics.
I think that's a really little known fact as well, because I had no idea that, people were in there just based on religion.
If you look at it, you'll find that a number of bishops are there because they're members of the Church of England. There are one or two other religions now represented, but that's a sort of palliative. That's almost a sop, you could argue, because other people have objected. So, if you feel that clerics should make laws, then fine, you're in the right place. If you feel that clerics shouldn't make laws, well, you need to think about how you're going to change that. But the fact for 100 years it hasn't been changed is surely some sort of indictment.
Oh, 100%. And I think that's part of the things. We don't have the power to change any of that right now. Obviously, we have 8% of the representation in the House of Commons. So even if every Scottish MP did come together, now that's very unlikely, but they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And that's a big part of the reason I think so many people support independence is because we're stuck. We can't change anything.
Well, you see, if people accepted that argument, they wouldn't vote for anyone. I think what's important is to say this, and I'll come to Keir Starmer in a second. The reality is that and why it's important to have independents supporting MPs in the House of Commons. There's two main reasons. One is to make sure that people get their drains fixed and their road pipes. I don't know, but a lot of that is now responsibility of the Scottish Parliament and up to them to take care of that. But the other important factor is that whenever there's a hung Parliament, the third party has enormous power. Enormous power, because the two parties, whichever of the two parties wishes to govern, has to cut a deal somewhere. Now, the SNP have always said they would never support a non-progressive party, and by that they mean the Tories. Yeah. But I suspect, even though he says otherwise, that Keir Starmer, if he were elected tomorrow, and he didn't have a majority over the Conservatives, would be rushing to Stephen Flynn's door on bended knee to say, look, can you and I perhaps get together and work something out here? And could you please forgive me for all the nasty things I said about you.
I think that's a big thing as well, because obviously, as we know, in our councils, there's lots of Labour and Conservative coalitions. And I truly think people in England and Wales would be horrified to find out that Labour and the Conservatives were teaming up, all across Scotland, when they're supposed to be complete opposite sides of, the political spectrum. They're supposed to stand for different values, but they feel comfortable enough to work with each other up here.
I think, I hate to be cynical, but the reality is that the present government is the best that money can buy. And lots of people have bought it. So there's proof there. Oh, by the way, you've got sunshine where you are. Why? It's impressive.
I'm sitting at my window. Nowhere else to sit.
See, people often complain that Scotland isn't sunny, and here you are showing that that's all nonsense. You're basking in sunshine there.
Once in a blue moon. It's bringing out my blue eyes.
But yeah, the reality is that the House of Commons is set up for what's known as Buggins' term. In other words, I'm the government of the day. I will do all sorts of things that makes people's life miserable, and all sorts of stuff like that. And I'll be called to account, and then it'll be your chance, and then you'll make a mess of it, and then I'll get back in again. All I have to do is wait 4 or 5 years. And if you're particularly useless, you might not even serve the whole 4 or 5 years, and we won't be able to get rid of you in 2 or 3 years.
Boris Johnson.
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson, yes, but no, because what happened was, because the Tories ended up with such an enormous majority, they effectively, and the UK effectively, became a one-party state. In other words, they could change their leader whenever they wanted, for whatever reason, and the rest of us were never consulted.
No, it's because they've got such a large majority.
That's
they don't
why.
They don't need the votes of any other party currently.
But you see, in a modern state, there would be a constitution. And the constitution would say what the Tories just did, changing prime minister 3 times in 3 weeks or whatever the hell it was, that would be illegal. It would be unconstitutional. So they just couldn't do it. In other words, if they wanted to change the leader, the constitution might say you have to go back to the country and ask their permission. Because in the UK, the prime minister has a it's a very powerful position. So to be in a powerful position without any meaningful constraints is disastrous. It's hugely undemocratic if you believe that democracy is about respecting the wishes of the people.
I think
So
that.
How would you change that in Scotland? How would you prevent the first Scottish government acting exactly like the present Westminster government does after independence?
A written constitution. It's what we need. And I think the one that we had before the union's very important. It had very good things. It was obviously all about popular sovereignty. The people are sovereign. And I think we've seen a tad of, so not as bad, because obviously we know that it went from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak. But obviously we've just seen that within the SNP as well. We've went from Nicola to Humza, whereas we could also say, maybe they should have went back to the people, had a wee vote, and see if we wanted Humza or not.
Yeah. There's a lot of purchase in that argument, I have to say. I do feel that if you're going to make a change of that nature, i.e. the top job, as it were, and you believe in democracy, I can't see anything terribly wrong with putting it to the people again. Because look what happens if you don't. If you don't, you end up in the position that Rishi Sunak and the First Minister are in, where you get the press effectively become the fourth estate, as it were. They become critical because what they're saying is that they can question the authority of the leader because the leader hasn't gone to the people. If the leader had gone to the people, then he could say, something, I don't care what you say. The people have spoken. And
Aye,
in democracy, their view is more important than some guy jabbing his finger on BBC Scotland News.
exactly. And that's what Nicola Sturgeon was able to do, because obviously the people of Scotland returned her not just once, not just twice, not just 3 times.
Let me ask you a basic question now,
Yeah.
because there'll be a bunch of people watching us and listening. I believe that nationalism is a bad thing. In other words, if you look at nationalist movements across the world, some of them are really flaky. They're far right. They believe, they don't believe in democracy. They believe in pushing a far right agenda. How would you respond to that?
I've never seen that from the Scottish independence movement, not in 2014, not ever. Obviously, the current independence movement, a large part of it is reopening Scotland up to the world, internationalist. Obviously, we can see that our current governing party is disgusted at the way that the London government is treating refugees. And I think if it was some ultra right-wing movement, they would be having the same opinions on refugees and things like that. But I don't view self-determination as nationalism. There's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting your country's future to be in your country's hands.
So let's talk a little bit about human rights, because you just raised it just now in terms of asylum seekers. One of the things that's disturbed me as I listen to government ministers is how wedded they are to this far right argument that says pretty much all foreigners are bad, and foreigners with no money are even worse. And the notion that somebody will turn up on the beaches at Dover, penniless, expecting us to somehow help them is outrageous. And in fact, if you think what I've just said is outrageous, I'm simply repeated the words that the Home Secretary used, which I think are awful, frankly, and disgusting, right? I mean,
I find it hypocritical. We only because obviously we all know Britain's history. We went knocking around doors around half the world. So I don't understand how we can complain about people. Obviously, they're not knocking on our door the same way that we knocked on theirs. But do you get the point I'm trying to make?
Well, I think it's a reasonable point. What you're saying is that, well, when I was at school, and hopefully this didn't happen when you were at school, my teacher at primary school went to a map of the world with all these red dots on it, or big spaces coloured in red, and said, look at that. The sun never sets on the British Empire. In other words, she was inordinately proud of the fact that we had invaded all these countries. She didn't see it as a problem. In fact, when somebody in the class said, why are we in all these countries? Her answer was, we have to civilize the natives.
It's disgusting, isn't it? I just sit there and I think, how are we more civilized than anybody else? Every country has their own cultures, their own customs, and no one country is better than any other.
Yeah. And by the way, Hashbury, that's not the way you spell draft, mate. But it just came up on the TNT thing. You're right. I mean, there's something terribly ironic about saying to people from India, we're here to civilize you. People in India had more civilization than anyone on this island way back in the BCE years, i.e. going back into 100 BC. There was more civilization in India then, when people on this island thought that running about covered in blue paint was a fashion statement. I mean, it's ridiculous to use that terminology about people. And if you doubt any of this, there's a terrific book by William Dalrymple which deals with this whole subject. I've got it on my shelves here somewhere. No, somebody's borrowed it, but he talks about the British Empire in India. Everybody should get a copy of it. If you can't afford it, it's a big thick book. There's a TV series coming out soon on Netflix, where you'll learn exactly what the British did.
That sounds really, really interesting. I'm definitely going to give that a watch.
It's well worth it. He's a fine author, and he's written some excellent stuff. But you could have actually written the same story almost about South Africa, great pieces of Africa. You could have written the same story about a whole range of countries across the world that the British went to civilize the natives. But the reality is that the British went there for mercantile reasons in large part. You know. Have you heard of the triangular trade?
It's ringing a bell.
Triangular trade, very British. What happened was trinkets were taken from Bristol. They were given to people in West Africa in order to buy slaves.
Oh yeah, I know what you're speaking about.
The slaves in West Africa went across the Atlantic, where they worked on the sugar plantations. And then the sugar was brought back to Bristol. The triangular trade. But it was based on a previous model in which the primary product was not sugar. Can you guess what it was?
People.
No, opium.
Oh yeah.
The British took tea from India. This is all in Dalrymple's book, by the way, so I'm not saying anything it's novel. I'm simply suggesting that not everyone knows these stories, and they need to know these stories in order to form a judgment about whether to maintain and sustain the present system. Tea was taken from India, was sold in, was used to get opium, and the opium was a lot of the opium came from India as well, and it was forced upon the Chinese. And when the Chinese government objected to opium being forced on the local people, the British brought in the troops to force the Chinese to consume opium.
It's so bad.
It's just awful. And if people just opened a history book once in a while, it would be, I mean, honestly.
They'd find out. I think what's really ironic as well is obviously we said that we were there to civilize India. How were we civilizing them? Records have came out that obviously during our 180, 200 years of rule, we extracted 45 trillion worth of their...
Well, it's interesting, but bringing things up to the present day, I mean, and somebody said, well, you know, the Americans are doing much the same. Well, that's true, because they copied the previous empires. I'm not saying, by the way, that anything that the British Empire did was exceptionally heinous compared to what other empires had done, but it was pretty close. In fact, it did from time to time become much worse. I mean, for example, not everyone knows this. Do you know where the first concentration camps were?
Where was it? Kenya or was it South Africa? And it was
South Africa.
Aye.
And why did the British set up concentration camps in South Africa?
Was it not to keep the Boers under control?
The Boers were exceptionally good at fighting, not in pitched battles, which the British preferred, because they would always win, but they were good at guerrilla tactics. And it was established that if the women and children were collected together, it would concentrate the minds of the Boers. And by the way, the Boer is just a Dutch word for farmer.
Okay.
It just doesn't sound so exotic if you say the Second Farmers' War. Sounds better when you say the Second Boer War. But you know, so the women and children were concentrated in these camps, and many of them died. And it was an awful, obscene tragedy. In fact, there was one gross example of it, where a woman in charge representing the women in the camp, went to the British general in charge and said, look, I gather that your dance floor is being refurbished. Could we please have the wood? And that was refused. So, you know, I think we need to understand. So I think if you don't know what you've been, it's what you've been that makes you what you are. And that applies as much to states as it does to people. And if you've done lots of things that maybe you shouldn't have done, then there comes a time when you have to sit down and say, this is what I am, this is what I was. And that way you can come to terms with yourself, I think. And I think the same thing applies to countries. I think states as well need to have that conversation. In other words, the conversation should be, well, somebody's saying, you mean, what about the Boers misspelt? It's spelt with an E, by the way, that then implemented apartheid. Yes, I'm not saying the Boers were angels. All I'm saying is we didn't treat them like angels, that's for sure.
No.
Yeah, so you know, to me, the big value about a constitution, which you talked about earlier, is that a constitution puts in writing what a country stands for and what it will not stand for.
Aye.
And I think that's key. I really do. And the fact that the UK doesn't have a written codified constitution, I think speaks volumes. Because it says to me that that conversation about values, about principles, about ethics, about morals has not really taken place the way it has in other countries. And because it hasn't taken place, we're all over the lot when it comes to deciding things.
Aye. I think that's how Westminster gets away with a lot. Because, for example, if you look at the United States, as soon as the government tries to come for their rights, they're like, no, my First Amendment. Obviously, there's some things in their constitution that are controversial, not everybody agrees with. But the main point is that they know their rights, they are written, and as soon as the government tries to walk over them, the people know it because they know their rights within their constitution.
Yeah. I'm going to show you something now.
Okay.
This is a book. Can you read it? I know it's reversed out. But
no, I've got the sun in my eyes and it's reversed.
Well, okay. For some reason, my camera is reversing everything out, including the logo on my shirt. But here we are. What it says is, your rugged constitution. And what it says and what it means to Americans today, this is a textbook which 7-year-olds read in the United States. And it's all about their constitution.
Aye.
It's all about the constitution. And it's got little diagrams and it's got... It's important enough to talk to primary school kids about the principles that underpin the state. If you can't have that discussion about the basic morals of the place that you're in, then you're lost. There's no anchor. You know, every problem in the world that comes along and buffets you as a state or as a country leaves you having to go back to try and unpick what you didn't fully understand in the first place. And that's a tragedy, it seems to me. And people are saying, well, you know, a highly outdated and problematic constitution. Yeah, I don't know which one you're talking about. You have to keep these things up to date. How many amendments? Because you can't expect a bunch of guys sitting down in 1776 to draft a constitution and have suggested to them that they're so prescient that they can anticipate what the 21st century looks like. Of course they couldn't. But they could figure out the morals of that.
Aye. I think having a constitution helps you define your country's culture as well. Like, for example, you'll hear from lots and lots of Americans, their constitution is a massive part of being American. And then in the modern day, when you think about what is Britishness, there's not really anything. You can't really pin anything down to Britishness. And I think that's a large part of the reason why people feel more British because that was in the time of empire, and that's what people used to feel British. Look at this massive, glorious empire. That's what they all used to think. Whereas people being born now, there's nothing like that. And we're like, what is Britishness? And you can't, I don't know. I really don't.
Yeah, I just find it very odd. Now, of course, what helped a lot of the countries that do have constitutions is they went through enormous change.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking about the French Revolution, we're talking about the American Revolution, we're talking about Italian Revolution. You know, these were not terribly pleasant times to be there.
No.
But if there was a positive to them, that there was a conversation that was held thereafter, and the conversation was, we need something that binds us all together morally, ethically, where we can talk about our principles and stuff, you know. And maybe a lot of people will be thinking to themselves, oh, what are morals and principles and ethics got to do with anything? Well, you know, when you get as old as me and you look back on your life, believe me, it's the thing that counts almost as much as anything else, apart from maybe family. And that's important. You know, it's you don't have to be hugely religious, by the way. I'm not terribly religious at all, but I can still be ethical and moral and feel that things. It's important to be able to tell right from wrong.
Aye.
And I think everybody should be able to do that, or at least have some way of dealing with the crises that come along. You know, I mean, everyone at 16 believes that they know everything they need to know. There's a lovely saying by Mark Twain, which people might enjoy. When Mark Twain was 15, he thought his father was the most ignorant man he'd ever met. By the time he was 20, he was truly astonished by how much his father had learned in 5 short years. And it's just the nature of the human condition. You know, we like to think we know everything. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. You know, old people look at young people and say, oh, you've never lived up. You know, who cares? You know,
Exactly.
You know, you bring enthusiasm to the party. It's what old people don't have. Like, seriously.
No,
and you can't measure it. You can't make it.
I'm completely agreeing with what you're saying about morals and what you stand for. Because if you don't know what you stand for and you don't know what your morals are, you can easily be led down paths that obviously you don't really believe in. But obviously, because we're speaking about culture and Britishness and Scottishness, when I think of Scottishness, I think of obviously banter and the way that, do you know how you know a Scottish person likes you is when they take the mick out you. Do you know sort of things like that?
Well, there's a lot of truth in that, but
Exactly.
But then when I'm in Ireland, people say the same thing to me. They say, you always know you're in Ireland because somebody wants to have a fight. And I think, well, that's not true. But that's Irish people taking the mickey at themselves. But, you know, it's very healthy. But you have to have a good sense of yourself to be able to take the mickey out of yourself. And I think that's maybe what's missing, you know, because, and I'll put this question to you. But when you look at the political parties in Scotland, the ones that favour independence, and do you feel that they have the enthusiasm to carry the day, or do you feel that they've lost something out there somewhere?
I feel that they've lost something, and it's mainly just because of the refusal to try a different path than Section 30s. Now, I can understand that they want to follow domestic laws and things like that, but you're never going to get out of an abusive marriage by using the abuser's terms. And obviously, I'm just using that as, an example. Like, for me, after the second time they were told no to Section 30, that is when they should have been like, okay, but we'll just find some way else. Obviously, I don't think they figured out what that way will be. Obviously, we've got campaigns going on like Salvo. Their way is obviously taking the conditions of the treaties and acts of union to an international basis and taking it away from domestic powers, away from domestic laws, and saying, we've tried to play your game. You don't want to have, like, give us any, I'm trying to think of the right word, but yeah, I just really, really don't think that they've got much passion anymore. Obviously, we've just seen Humza ask Rishi for another Section 30. I think we all knew what the answer was going to be.
Well, I think that's probably the case. I mean, but, there's some validity in putting a question. I wouldn't have put the question he put necessarily, but I think you have to put the question about democracy.
Yeah.
You either believe in democracy or you don't.
Exactly.
You can't be a little bit pregnant and you can't be a little bit democratic. The fact of the matter is, you're either for it or you're not, and you have to take the consequences for good or ill. If the decisions go against you, because that's what the people want, right? And all this sort of nonsense about camper vans and stuff. I mean, it's a sideshow. The big decisions are being taken elsewhere, and we're probably about to enter a situation where the next UK election will be decided not on the economy, which has generally been the case for the last 20, 30 years, but on culture.
Yeah.
In other words, people will be told that unless you vote for party X, then a whole bunch of very strange people are going to take over the government. Or alternatively, if you don't vote for party Y, then you'll find that the people with values that you don't somehow are not sympathetic to will be in charge. And there'll be a lot of that nonsense going on. And I think this business about the boats and the asylum seekers is all part and parcel of that. For example, let's say you stopped every single boat landing in the UK. How would that affect the price of vegetables and fruit and cheese? It wouldn't have the slightest effect.
No.
And that's what people are asking about. If you stopped every single boat, would it improve the NHS?
No.
If you stopped every single boat, would the trains run better? If you stopped every single boat, would you be able to see a GP sooner? Nonsense. It's just nonsense on stilts, but that's where they want you to look.
Aye. And I think that's a big part of the, things that are going on with the SNP right now. Obviously, as we've seen, the media, they're all over them, but they're not on, what's the Lord's name? Michelle Monroe, is it? Who's obviously just got away with a lot of money. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about other things. And I get lots and lots of comments. The SNP's fallen apart, and they think that that means independence goes with the SNP. And it's like, you really don't understand. There's over 1 million Scots. We don't care what happens to the SNP. We will never stop fighting for independence. The SNP has a downfall, great. We'll vote in another independence party, or we'll try another route.
But, I think you make a good point, James, particularly if you look at this thing in an historical context. Almost every secessionist or a separatist or independence movement in the world has gone through similar patterns. This is not unique. This is not peculiar to the SNP. It's not, every time there's been an independence movement, it's been riven with dissension and different views. Ireland was like that. I think Malta was like that. The United States was definitely like that. The Americans are independent now, and they will say, look, we have the Constitution which binds us all together. But way back then in 1776, you would have, I'll tell you how crazy it was. Alexander Hamilton, who was in charge of finances in the first American government, right, was so upset by some of the things that one of his colleagues said that he challenged them to a duel.
Imagine that happening today.
Yeah. They go to this little island and they take a pot shot at each other. Hamilton turned out to be a very poor shot. The other guy plugged him. and Alexander Hamilton died as a result. So to say that, oh, come on, guys, open a history book. This is nothing new.
Aye.
This road has been traveled many times in the past. So put it all in context, take a deep breath and move on. And I think the people who need to move on, and I think you make a very good point, maybe some of the older people should just move aside. Maybe that's the answer. Just move aside, guys, gals, just move aside. And let some younger people take over.
So obviously the mindset that independence is dead, whatever, I don't think it is. I think our politicians have just ran out of ideas and steam, but you've actually raised a really good point by mentioning Malta. And obviously we've been speaking about Ireland. So obviously when Malta was going for their independence, they were told you won't be able to afford your food imports without us. Ireland, obviously, we know the stereotypes that were put forth about Irish people. And see, if you look today, they're the best performing, the fastest growing economy in Europe this year. Obviously, there's multiple factors to that. One major reason being that they are now the gateway to the EU for the USA. It used to be Britain, now it's obviously Ireland. And I read in an article, they have a 10 billion surplus in their budget. Obviously, they've got their housing problems and everything. That's all governmental choice, though. That's easily fixed by voting in a government that, will actually fix it. But the main point is, both these small countries were told, you can't make it without Westminster. And look, they're doing better than us now.
Well, it's not just the small countries, James.
Mm-hmm.
India was told the same thing.
Yeah.
And according to the statistics, India will shortly become, well, fairly soon, become the largest. It will have the largest population in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And at one time, it was all run from the East India Company in London.
Aye.
The biggest country in the world soon. Now, do people in India have very fond memories of the UK? I guess some do, maybe in the ruling elite, perhaps. I suspect many of the others perhaps don't. I suspect many of the others share the same view of the UK as Joe Biden, for example, who, when he was elected and he was leaving a room, he was chased by somebody from the BBC, and they said, "Do you have a few words for the BBC?" And he turned around and he said, "I'm Irish." Now, it's easy to be flippant, but the reality is that if you want to be elected in the United States and you cannot command the support of the Irish American community, you are going to have a great deal of difficulty getting elected.
Aye.
So but that, a lot of people have a certain Irish descent in the United States, have a very somewhat jaundiced view of the UK, let's put it that way, because they went through a famine and they feel that the British government could have done a lot more than it did, shipping wheat out of the country when people were starving. And that's certainly the case, that did happen. And people who pleaded with the British government for some refuge were summarily dismissed. So there's a lot to be, and furthermore, if you want to talk about famines, there was a famine in India, which was presided over by the British government. So, these people have long memories. Their history books are not like our history books.
No.
They tend to tell the truth and be candid. So, face up to these things, deal with them, and join the world on its terms, rather than sound exceptionalist and going for special pleading. I mean, there's no need for it. And the world is a nice place if you're prepared to engage with them nicely. It's a terrible place if you engage with it badly.
It'll always puzzle me why so many Scottish people have the opinion that we couldn't survive on our own, when if read a book and it's blown out the water. There is over 60, 70 countries that are smaller than Scotland, have less of a population, have less resources. I will never know how the third richest oil and gas country in Europe has been made to believe that it can't survive on its own. It's like, really, people, really?
I've got a question for you, because I've been listening closely to what you've been saying, and I want to put this question to you, James. We don't have much time left. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. When I go to places overseas, Spain, Portugal, people by and large like Scotland.
Yeah.
And they say things to me like, why do you hesitate? Why do you hesitate? Why are you sitting there complaining about what Westminster says and does? Why don't you do something?
I think the answer is really simple, John. We have been gaslighted, manipulated, and fed this narrative for 300 years that we can't leave, we need Westminster, we need their money, when it's not true. And see, if people just believed in themselves, believed in their countrymen, and woke up to the fact that all of the countries of the British Empire were told the exact same thing. They were gaslighted, they were manipulated, but it came to the point where they realized that was what is happening. And I truly, truly believe that that is what is happening in Scotland now. We are waking up to the fact that we've been lied to, gaslighted, and manipulated for 300 years, that we can't leave when we can, and we can thrive.
Okay, very interesting. So if people are watching tonight, obviously, they can go and watch the TNT show, but say they wanted to connect with you and talk some more, is it straightforward for them to do so, James?
Oh yeah, 100%. People can message me on here, comment on a video, tell me to follow them back. I'll follow them back. They can message. My Twitter messages are public. Anyone can message me. I'm always open for debate, always open for discussions. And that's what people have realized, on here. Obviously, users, just getting into TikTok and things. But I've always told everybody, I'm absolutely happy to have a debate with anybody, to have a discussion with anybody, because I don't view it as unionists versus independence people. We are all Scottish people that simply view things differently, and you never know, we could learn something from each other.
Well, that wouldn't be unusual. I mean, the Americans learned a lot from, when the Americans got round to declaring independence, the country was split 3 ways. There was those who wanted to be independent. There was a bunch of people who felt that it was important to stay connected to Westminster and be part of that empire. And there was a bunch of folks in the middle who didn't know which end was up. And eventually the UK government made so many mistakes that that group in the middle moved into the independence camp. But it was still tough. I mean, the reason that, and Americans don't talk about this too much, but the reality was there was a war. The Americans were confronted with the best army and the best navy in the world, and they won. But the reality is they would not have done so had it not been for the French.
Well, to be honest, I think lots of countries have the French to thank for a lot. Like even Scotland, if it wasn't for France a few times, as sad as it is, we would have had the same fate as Wales a couple of times if it wasn't for the French. And obviously they helped the Americas. They tried to help Ireland a few times. But obviously we're not naive. We do know a big part of it was they were just trying to get one up on England.
James, we're just about out of time. If I check, we've got about 2 minutes. Are there any last points you would like to make? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel we should have covered? I know we've been on air for an hour, and it just goes by so quickly, particularly when we're trying to respond to questions as well. Is there anything you just want to touch upon very briefly that we haven't covered that you would like to have had us cover?
We've covered so much. Put him on the spot, John. No, I think, I don't know, I think everyone's opinion is valid, but I think it's time for Scotland to realise that this mindset that we can't go it alone, that we're too poor. It's just not true, and it's not. And I think it's time for people to wake up to that. The argument that people want to stay in the union because they love the union, that is completely valid, and I totally respect that. But this mindset that it's because we can't be independent, I think it really needs to change. And yeah, I don't know.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Could I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
And it's this. The easiest way to change the minds of an old person is for a young person to talk to them. And the younger, the better. Pretty much everyone I know over 60 who've changed their minds on the question of the Constitution has done so because somebody, a grandchild or somebody in the family has come to them and said, can we sit down and talk about this? So I don't think young people should feel in any way disadvantaged here. I think there's a huge potential audience out there. And it's like talking within the family. And I think that's going to be key. And I think that will bring about more change. Almost every single person who changes their mind on any major subject does so because of a conversation they've had, not because of some fancy advertising or whatever, politicians or whatever. It's mano a mano, person to person. That's what changes.
Well, you've raised a really, really good point. So one of my aunties, she's not actually my auntie, but you know, like your Scottish auntie, they've raised you so they're your auntie. So she's born in England. She comes from London, but she's lived here for about 20, 25 years now. She was a solid no. And it was because I don't know what her dad told her. She would never ever tell me. But see, after I started posting, she started watching my videos and realized that what I was posting was the truth. Do you know, she phoned me a few months ago and she's like, when's the vote again, James? I was like, Jenna, it's not happening. And she's like, no, I want to vote yes now. And I was like, yes, my work's done.
Well, that's a great story to end with. And I hope people will take a pointer from that because it is terribly important. I mean, you know, I know sometimes when you're young, you feel, oh, gracious, nobody's listening to me, but then everybody's listening to you because you represent the future. And that's the most, seems to me, that's the most important voice of all. Well, we've gone through our 60 minutes. In fact, we've probably exceeded it a little bit. Thanks very much, James. I want to make a few concluding remarks, if I may. One is, please look out for my column in the Sunday National at the weekend. I haven't decided what I'm going to be writing about yet, so I can't give you any advance information, but it'll be the usual polemic. And people seem to like it, and I thank them for liking it. And it'll be in the 7 days supplement on Sunday. Do look out for that, and look out for all the other TNT shows. We've got an amazing list of guests coming up for future shows. And it's been fantastic this evening. A big thanks, James. I appreciate it so much for you being on.
No, thank you, John, for having me.
It's been great. And a big thank you to everyone out there who've been listening and watching us. And if you missed anything, as I said at the beginning of the show, this show will be on YouTube. You can go and watch it at your leisure anytime you like.